The woman and the door. Morning was quiet, but a storm was about to begin inside a small bank on a busy street. People stood in line, holding papers, sighing, checking their phones. At the back of the line stood an old woman in a faded blue. Sorry. Her hands trembled as she clutched a worn-out envelope. Her hair was gray and pulled back neatly, but her eyes looked tired and worried. No one really looked at her. To them, she was just another customer. But she kept glancing at the clock on the wall, as though she was racing it. She finally reached the counter and handed the envelope to the young teller, who looked annoyed before even opening it. "Madame," he said, without even glancing up, "this form is wrong, and you cannot withdraw this much cash without proper ID." The old woman looked confused. She tried to explain that her ID card had been stolen a week ago. She said she had her passbook, her photo, and even a police complaint letter. Her voice shook as she spoke. "Please, Beta," she said softly. "This is for my grandson's hospital bill. I have no one else. I came here yesterday, but they sent me back. Today, they told me to bring this complaint letter, and now you're saying it's still not enough." The teller rolled his eyes and called his manager. The manager came over, tall and impatient. He looked at the papers, barely reading them, and said in a cold voice, "Madam, rules are rules. We cannot help you. Come back when you have proper ID." Next customer. The old woman froze. She whispered, "Please, he is in the hospital. He needs this now." But the manager snapped, "Madam, you're holding up the line. Please leave." She stepped aside, but she didn't leave. She stood quietly in the corner, clutching the envelope. Everyone ignored her. Some customers muttered under their breath that she should just go. A security guard came over after a while. He said loudly, "Madam, you need to leave now. You are creating a scene." She looked at him, her eyes full of tears, but she didn't move. The guard gently but firmly took her arm and began to escort her to the door. Her envelope slipped from her hand and scattered papers all over the floor. Nobody moved to help her. They just stared. Just then, the glass door of the bank swung open. A man in a simple shirt and jeans walked in. He carried a small black backpack and a calm air about him. His eyes immediately fell on the scene at the door, the guard pushing the old woman outside as her papers fluttered to the floor. The man stepped forward and said quietly, "Excuse me, what is happening here?" The guard frowned. "Sir, this is none of your business. Please wait your turn." But the man ignored him. He crouched down and began picking up the woman's papers. The old woman looked at him in surprise and whispered, "Bayet, no, don't trouble yourself." He smiled softly and said, "It's no trouble." He stood up, handed her the envelope, and turned to the guard. "She's with me," he said. The guard hesitated. The manager came over, annoyed. "Sir, is there a problem?" The man replied, "Yes, there seems to be a big problem, but don't worry, I'll take care of it." The manager crossed his arms. "Sir, who exactly are you to take care of it?" The man smiled faintly. "I'm Sundar," he said. "Sundar Pichai." The room fell silent. For a moment, no one moved. The teller's mouth fell open. The manager's face turned pale. Sundar helped the old woman back to a chair and sat next to her. "Don't worry, Amma," he said gently. "You sit here. I'll speak to them." He stood and turned back to the manager. "Now," Sundar said, "let's talk about respect, and rules, and kindness." And that was when the real storm began. The confrontations bank was silent. But it was not the kind of silence that feels calm. It was the heavy, tense kind of silence when everyone knows something important is about to happen, but no one dares to speak first. Sundar stood at the center of the floor, his simple shirt slightly wrinkled from travel, his backpack still slung over one shoulder. The old woman sat on the chair where he had gently left her, her thin fingers still clutching the envelope like it was her last possession on earth. She kept glancing up at Sundar, her lips moving as if she wanted to say something, but no sound came out. The manager finally broke the silence with a forced laugh that didn't reach his eyes. He stepped closer, lowering his voice, but not his arrogance. "Sir," he said, "I think you misunderstand. This is just a routine matter. The lady has no valid ID, and according to the rules, we cannot process her request. It's very simple. We have to follow protocol. We ask that you don't interfere." But Sundar's eyes met his without flinching. "Do you really think this is simple?" Sundar asked, his voice quiet but steady. "What is her name?" The manager blinked. He glanced at the teller and then back at Sundar. "Excuse me, what is her name?" Sundar repeated. "The woman you pushed to the door. The woman you humiliated in front of everyone here. Do you even know her name?" The manager opened his mouth, but no words came out. Sundar nodded slightly. "That," he said softly, "is the problem." For the first time, the other customers in the bank started shifting uncomfortably, looking away from their phones and papers. Some of them even stole quick glances at the old woman, as though noticing her properly for the first time. Sundar took a deep breath and looked around the room. "Do you see her?" he asked, his voice carrying now so everyone could hear. "She came here yesterday, she says. She brought what you asked her to bring. She begged for help. She told you it was for her grandson's hospital bills. And yet you all treated her like she was invisible, like she was a burden, like she didn't matter. Do you think rules are more important than people? Do you think paper is more valuable than a human life? The teller who had spoken to the woman earlier tried to mumble something about security policies, but his voice cracked and faded under Sundar's stare. Sundar walked slowly to the counter and placed his backpack on it. He unzipped it and pulled out a small leather notebook, flipping through it until he found a blank page. He took a pen from his pocket, wrote something, tore out the sheet, and handed it to the manager. "Call this number," he said simply, "and tell them I sent you. They'll explain why I'm standing here today and why you should listen very carefully to what I'm about to say." The manager took the paper, clearly shaken now, and handed it to the guard, who disappeared into the back room to make the call. While they waited, Sundar knelt down in front of the old woman. His face softened, and he spoke in a tone so kind and warm that a few people standing nearby actually felt their throats tighten just hearing it. "Oma," he said gently, "what is your name?" She blinked, as though startled by the question. "Kamala," she whispered. "Kamala," he repeated, as though saying a prayer. "How old is your grandson?" 7, she said. He has a heart problem. Doctor said, if we wait, it could." She stopped, her hands beginning to tremble harder. Sundar reached out and placed his hands over hers. "He will get the treatment," Sundar said firmly. "I promise you." Just then, the guard returned, looking pale and nervous. He handed the phone to the manager and whispered something. The manager's face drained of all color as he put the phone to his ear. Yes, sir," he stammered after a moment. "I understand, of course, right away. No, I assure you it won't happen again." He hung up slowly, his hands shaking now. He looked at Sundar with something like fear in his eyes. Mr. Pichai," he began, his voice cracking. I had no idea you didn't have to know who I was," Sundar interrupted softly. "You only had to know who she was, a customer, a human being, and you failed." The manager swallowed hard. We can fix this," he said quickly. "Right now. Will I process her withdrawal immediately? No problem at all." Sundar nodded. "Good," he said, "but this is not just about her. This is about everyone who comes here, about how you see them, about how you treat them. If a woman like Kamala cannot trust you to respect her dignity, then your rules mean nothing. Do you understand?" The manager nodded weakly. "Say it," Sundar demanded, his voice still calm but carrying a quiet authority that silenced even the whispers in the room. We understand," the manager said. "We will treat everyone with respect from now on." Sundar stared at him a moment longer before finally stepping back. Kamala's papers were gathered, her withdrawal processed within minutes. She clutched the money in her hands, staring at it in disbelief, tears rolling down her cheeks. But just as everyone thought the matter was finished, something unexpected happened. As the teller handed Kamala the cash, Sundar noticed a shadow cross her face. She hesitated, looking at the notes in her hand, and then back at the teller. This amount," she whispered. "This is not right. It is less than what I asked for." The teller froze. The manager's face hardened again, as if he had hoped she wouldn't notice. Sundar's eyes narrowed. He leaned closer and asked in a quiet but firm tone, "What do you mean?" Kamala's voice shook as she explained that she had requested the full balance of her savings, enough to cover her grandson's surgery. But the teller handed her a smaller amount, saying that her account didn't have enough. Yet Kamala insisted. She had checked the balance herself only a week ago, and it had been much more. Sundar turned his gaze to the teller, who now seemed to shrink behind the counter. The room, which had started to relax only moments ago, grew tense again. "Is this true?" Sundar asked the teller. The teller stammered. I don't know, maybe. There was a mistake in her record." Sundar reached across the counter, picked up a computer mouse, and said, "Then let's find out. Right now." The manager started to protest, but Sundar shot him a look that made him stop mid-sentence. They brought up her account on the screen. At first, everything seemed normal. But then Sundar noticed something odd. A series of withdrawals over the past few months that Kamala swore she never made. Large amounts, each just below the limit that required manager approval. All withdrawn at different branches. Kamala gasped when she saw the transactions. Her hands flew to her mouth and she shook her head in disbelief. "I never did this," she whispered. Sundar leaned back, his face darkening. He turned slowly to the manager. "Do you know what this means?" he asked quietly. The manager swallowed hard and said nothing. But Sundar already knew there was more to this story than just disrespect. There was something hidden beneath the surface, something much worse. He turned back to Kamala and said, gently, "Uma, you have been wronged. And now, we are going to find out who did this to you. I promise." The room was so quiet that even the clock on the wall seemed to stop ticking, and in that silence, Sundar's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen, and his eyes widened slightly. Then, without a word, he slid the phone back into his pocket. looked at the manager, and said, "You're not the only one who has some explaining to do." Asterisk, the hidden truth air in the bank grew heavy, thick with a silence that felt almost alive. Customers no longer shuffled papers or checked their phones. They simply stood and watched as Sundar slipped his buzzing phone back into his pocket. His expression calm but his eyes sharp, like someone who had just glimpsed the edge of a much larger mystery. Kamala sat clutching her envelope on her lap, but her gaze kept drifting to the computer screen where her account details glowed. The numbers still didn't make sense to her. Every few seconds she shook her head slightly, as though trying to convince herself this was all some strange dream. The manager hovered by the counter, his hands clasped tightly behind his back, beads of sweat glistening on his forehead. The teller refused to meet Sundar's eyes and busied himself rearranging papers that didn't need rearranging. The security guard stayed near the door but no longer looked so sure of his authority. Sundar finally broke the silence, his voice, low but carrying to every corner of the room. "These withdrawals," he said, pointing to the screen, "did not happen by accident. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. They kept each amount just under the approval threshold. They chose branches far apart so no one would notice. And they timed them carefully over months. That is not carelessness. That is theft." The manager tried to speak. "Mr. Pichai, please, I will investigate. We'll file a report," but Sundar held up a hand, cutting him off. "You had months to notice this," Sundar said quietly, "and you did nothing. She came here yesterday and begged you to help her. Even then, you sent her away. What kind of report would you file now? One that protects the truth, or one that protects yourselves?" The manager opened his mouth and closed it again. Sundar stepped closer to the counter. His presence didn't feel loud or aggressive, but it filled the room like a wave, impossible to ignore. He leaned slightly toward the teller and asked softly, "Tell me, who else has access to these accounts?" The teller swallowed hard and whispered, "Only the manager and the back office clerk." Sundar nodded slowly, as though he'd already guessed. Tati turned to Kamala and spoke gently, so only she could hear. "Amma, I need you to trust me now. There is more happening here than you realize, but we will uncover it. I promise you." Her eyes glistened with fresh tears, and she gave a small nod, her hands trembling as she held onto his sleeve for just a moment before letting go. Just then, the door at the back of the bank creaked open, and a thin man in a wrinkled white shirt stepped out. He was holding a stack of files and looking down at the floor as he walked, as though he wished to remain invisible. Sundar's eyes caught him immediately. "You," Sundar called out, his voice calm but firm. The man froze his shoulders stiffening. "Come here," Sundar said. The man hesitated but obeyed, shuffling forward. He avoided eye contact, clutching the files to his chest. "What is your name?" Sundar asked. "Mahesh," the man mumbled. "Mahesh," Sundar repeated, as though testing the name on his tongue. "How long have you worked here?" 10 years. Mahesh whispered. Sundar nodded thoughtfully. "Then you know every system in this branch, every customer, every rule, every loophole." Mahesh glanced nervously at the manager, who was now visibly sweating, his lips pressed into a thin line. Sundar noticed the glance, but said nothing about it yet. Instead, he leaned in slightly toward Mahesh and asked, "Who has been taking money from her account?" The entire room seemed to lean forward as though waiting for the answer. Mahesh's eyes darted from Sundar to the manager, to the teller, and back again. His hands tightened on the files until his knuckles turned white. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, the manager barked, "Enough. This is outrageous. You have no authority here, Mr. Pichai. You can't just come in and butt." Sundar's quiet voice cut through his protests like a knife. "Then call the police," Sundar said simply. The manager froze. His mouth worked. "Sound less lie." Sundar continued, his tone calm but full of quiet steel. "Call them," he said, "and let them come here and take everyone's statements. Let them pull the security footage, let them dig through the records. Go on, unless you have something to hide." The manager's face turned red. He stammered, There's no need for that. We can resolve this internally." But Sundar shook his head. "Not this time," he said firmly. Sundar pulled his phone out of his pocket and dialed a number. He spoke into it softly but clearly, and a few moments later he put the phone down and said to the room, "They'll be here in 15 minutes. The manager sank into a chair, his face pale now. Mahesh still stood frozen, his breathing quick and shallow. Then, in the silence that followed, Kamala spoke. Her voice was soft but carried a weight that silenced even the quietest whispers. "Why?" she asked, staring at the manager. "Why would you take my money? What did I ever do to you?" The manager flinched at her words, but it was Mahesh who finally broke. "It wasn't her fault," Mahesh whispered, his voice trembling. "She didn't know. He told me to do it. He threatened me." He pointed a shaking finger at the manager. The manager jumped to his feet. "That's a lie," he shouted. "You worthless little," but Sundar raised his hand, silencing them both. "Enough," Sundar said quietly. He looked at Mahesh and spoke gently. "Tell the truth," he said. "All of it, right now." Mahesh nodded, tears forming in his eyes. He had made me transfer small amounts from dormant accounts, Mahesh confessed, his voice cracking. He said no one would notice. He picked accounts that hadn't been touched in years. But then he started giving me names. Living customers. He said if I didn't do it, he would ruin me. Fire me. Make sure no one ever hired me again. I didn't know what to do. Kamala's hands flew to her mouth as she gasped. Sundar nodded slowly, as though he had expected this. Thank you, Sundar said to Mahesh. He turned to Kamala. AMMA, he said softly. This was never about you. You were just the easiest target. But now the truth is out, and you will get every rupee back. With interest, but even as he spoke, Sundar's phone buzzed again. He glanced at it and frowned slightly. He picked it up, listened for a few seconds, then his eyes narrowed in thought. What? He asked quietly into the phone. He listened some more. Then his jaw tightened. I see, he murmured. He put the phone down and turned to Kamala. Amma, he said gently, there's something else. Something you need to know. Something about your grandson. Kamala froze, her eyes wide with sudden fear. What do you mean? She whispered, but Sundar didn't answer right away. He looked toward the door, where the faint sound of sirens could now be heard in the distance. Then he turned back to Kamala, his face calm but his eyes dark with something deeper. I'll explain everything, he said softly, but there was something in his voice that sent a chill through the room. The secret about her grandson's sirens outside grew louder. A rising wail that pressed against the walls of the bank like a warning. People inside shifted uneasily, stealing glances at the door. Yet no one moved, no one spoke. All eyes were still on Sundar, and Kamala sat frozen in her chair, her thin hands clutching the envelope of cash, as though it were her last anchor to the earth. Her breath came shallow and quick, her lips moving silently as though whispering prayers to herself. She kept staring at Sundar, her gaze full of fear and hope mixed together, but Sundar's expression had changed. His calm composure was still there on the surface, but his eyes now held something harder, something darker. As though he was carrying a truth that he did not yet know how to say aloud. He stood still, his hand resting on the counter, his other hand lightly touching the phone in his pocket, where the last call had come from. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Kamala spoke. What is it, Beta? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What about my grandson? Tell me. Sundar took a long breath before he answered, his voice low and steady. Amma, he began, the hospital called me just now. They wanted to confirm some details about the payment for your grandson's treatment. Because someone else had already come forward claiming to be his guardian, someone who already paid a large amount on your behalf. Kamala blinked, confused, shaking her head slightly as though she hadn't heard him correctly. No, she said softly, that can't be. No one else. I have no one, only me. Who did this? Sundar crouched down to her level, meeting her eyes, his voice softened even more. They wouldn't tell me everything over the phone, he said gently, but they said the man who paid for the treatment gave them strict instructions. He left a note with the payment saying, don't tell her yet. Let her think she saved him. Let her believe it was her strength. Kamala's lips parted. In shock, she stared at him, her eyes filling with tears, her mouth trembling. I don't understand, she whispered. Who would? Just then, the police arrived. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside, their boots clicking loudly on the marble floor. They carried themselves with brisk efficiency, but even they slowed down when they saw Sundar standing there. They approached him and saluted slightly before speaking. Mr. Pichai, the senior officer said, we received your call. We're here to take statements and secure evidence. Sundar nodded and straightened. Thank you, he said. Please speak to Mahesh first. He knows what happened. Also, pull all the security footage and account records for the last 6 months. And keep the manager here. Don't let him leave. The manager, who had been trying to make himself invisible in the corner, visibly flinched. The officers moved toward Mahesh, who was still clutching his stack of files, looking as though the weight of his secret had finally broken him. But Kamala barely noticed any of it. Her hands were trembling harder now, her eyes glassy, her breathing uneven. She looked at Sundar, her voice shaking with confusion and quiet fear. Who would help me without telling me? She asked. Sundar sat beside her again. He lowered his voice so only she could hear. That, he said, is what I intend to find out. He stood up, pulled his phone out once more, and dialed a number. He stepped away toward the corner of the room, his tone calm but edged with urgency. Yes, he said softly. Find out who made the payment at the hospital. Check the surveillance there too. Send me the name and photo as soon as you can. He hung up and returned to Kamala, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Amma, he said, who else knows about your grandson? Anyone who might care for him, even if you've lost touch. She shook her head quickly. No, she said, my husband died years ago. My son, the boy's father, left us. No word from him in years. My daughter-in-law passed when the boy was only 2. It's just been me. Only me. Sundar frowned, thinking hard. Just then, his phone buzzed again. He picked it up, listened, and his eyes widened slightly as the person on the other end spoke. After a few moments, he said quietly, "Send me the picture." When the message arrived, he opened it and stared at the screen. For the first time, that day, his calm mask cracked, if only slightly. He turned the screen so that only he could see it for another moment, then slowly handed it to Kamala. "Is this man familiar to you?" he asked softly. Kamal appeared at the screen. The photo showed a man in his late 30s, standing at a hospital desk, signing some forms. His clothes were simple but neat, his expression serious but not unfriendly. She gasped sharply and covered her mouth with her hand. Her eyes flooded with tears as she whispered, "No, it can't be. That's my son." Her voice broke completely on the last word. Son crouched in front of her again, his voice steady but kind. He said, "Your son paid for his child's treatment, and he asked the hospital not to tell you. He wanted you to feel proud of what you did. Do you know where he is now?" Kamala shook her head, tears streaming freely. "He left years ago," she whispered. "He said he couldn't live like this. He said he hated me. He never wrote, never called. I thought he was dead." Sundar nodded slowly. "He is alive," he said gently, "and he came back, quietly, for his son." Kamala covered her face with both hands, sobbing now, her thin shoulders shaking. Sundar stayed by her side, letting her cry, letting her heart absorb the impossible news. But even as she wept, a darker thought crossed Sundar's mind. He stood up, turned slightly, and his eyes narrowed as he looked at the manager still sitting in the corner. His head bowed, because something didn't feel right. If the son had come back quietly and paid for his child's treatment, why had he kept it a secret from everyone, not just Kamala but the hospital too? Why had he slipped away before anyone could talk to him? And if he was alive and watching from the shadows, where was he now? Just then, his phone buzzed yet again. He picked it up, and a low voice on the other end said a few words that made Sundar's expression harden. "We traced the payment route," the voice said, "but there's more. You need to see this for yourself." Sundar's lips tightened. "Send me the address," he said. He hung up and turned back to Kamala. He said softly but firmly, "We're going to find him, today." She looked up, her face streaked with tears, her eyes full of something, between fear and fragile hope. You think he'll want to see me?" she asked in a broken voice. Sundar placed a hand over hers. "Whether he wants to see you or not," he said gently, "you deserve to know the truth." He stood, slung his backpack over his shoulder, and nodded to the officers, who were now escorting the manager and Mahesh into another room to take statements. Before he left, he glanced at the crowd still standing in silence. "Watch," he said, quietly, to no one in particular. "Watch what happens when you treat people with dignity. It changes everything." He opened the door, and the cool wind of the street swept into the room. Kamala hesitated, then slowly stood, clutching her envelope, and followed him outside. As they stepped into the bright sunlight, a car pulled up to the curb. Sundar opened the back door for her, helped her inside, then climbed in beside her. He gave the driver an address, and as the car pulled away from the bank, Kamala glanced at Sundar and whispered, "What if he doesn't forgive me?" Sundar looked out the window for a long moment before answering, his voice low but full of quiet strength. "Sometimes," he said, "the hardest part isn't being forgiven. It's forgiving ourselves." The car continued down the crowded street, carrying them toward the unknown. The reunion car moved steadily through the crowded streets, weaving past honking buses and carts loaded with fruit. Yet inside the car, the silence was thick. Kamala sat on the edge of her seat, clutching her envelope so tightly that the edges of the paper had begun to crumple. Her knuckles were white, her lips pressed into a thin line. Every so often, she would steal a glance at Sundar, who sat beside her, calm as ever, though his eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead, watching each turn as though it might reveal an answer. The city began to change outside the window. The bright shops and noisy chatter faded into quieter lanes, narrower roads lined with old houses and shuttered windows. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting a golden light that made everything feel softer, yet more uncertain. Kamala, single quotes, breathing grew shallow as they turned down a final dusty lane, and the car slowed to a stop in front of a low, faded house with peeling paint and an iron gate hanging loose on its hinges. Sundar glanced at her and spoke softly. "We're here," he said. She stared at the house for a long moment. Her hands trembled in her lap. What if he sends me away?" she whispered, her voice so small it almost disappeared into the air. Sundar placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. He said, "He came back for his son. He came back for you, even if he didn't say it aloud. No one who truly hates can make a choice like that. Trust me." She nodded faintly, though her eyes stayed glued to the door of the house. The driver opened the door, and Sundar stepped out first. He walked around to help Kamala out, and together they stood at the gate. the quiet of the lane pressing in around them. The faint sounds of a television and someone sweeping nearby drifted through the warm evening air. They walked up the short path to the door, and Sundar knocked gently. For a few moments, nothing happened. Then footsteps sounded inside, and the door creaked open. A man stood there. The same man from the photo, a little taller than Kamala, his face thinner now, his hair more gray than black, his shirt tucked neatly but looking worn at the edges. His eyes widened as he saw them, and for a moment he froze. Kamala single quotes as breath caught in her throat. Raju, she whispered. The man blinked, his jaw tightening. He opened the door a little wider but did not step back to let them in. You hear? He asked flatly. His voice was low and calm, but there was a quiet edge to it, like a rope pulled too tight. Kamala's lips trembled. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Sundar stepped forward slightly, his voice gentle but steady. She came to thank you, Sundar said, and to understand why you kept yourself hidden. Rayu's eyes flicked to Sundar, then back to his. Mother, he let out a sharp breath, almost a laugh, but without humor. Thank me, he muttered. After everything. She doesn't even know what she's thanking me for. Kamala swallowed hard, her voice finally breaking through the knot in her throat. You saved my grandson, she whispered. Our grandson. Why would you not tell me? Why would you hide? While you looked at her for a long moment, his hands, resting on the doorframe, curled into fists. His eyes glimmered in the fading light. Because you didn't want me, he said quietly. Kamala flinched, as though struck. That's not true, she said, her voice cracking. But Raju shook his head. Don't lie to me now, he said. You always wanted me to be someone else, someone better, someone who never made mistakes. When I failed, you didn't comfort me, you shamed me. When I left, you never called me back. You told everyone you had no son, so I became no one. Tears slid down Kamala's cheeks as she whispered. I was angry. I was hurt. But I never stopped loving you. You never showed it, he shot back, his voice harder now. Not once. And when I heard about my son in the hospital, I came back. I stayed quiet because I didn't want to see that same look in your eyes again. Disappointment. Shame. Kamala covered her face with her hands and sobbed, her shoulders shaking. Sundar stayed still, watching them both, letting the words fall between them like stones in water. But after a moment, Sundar spoke, his voice soft but carrying a quiet authority. Raju, he said, do you know what your mother did to get here? She stood in a bank all morning, humiliated herself in front of strangers, begged for help she didn't get. She was willing to empty every rupee she had just to save your son. She walked through her own shame because she still believed you wouldn't come. And even after everything, even after you left her, she still fought for you, for him. Raju. Eyes flicked to Sundar, then back to his mother. His jaw clenched. And do you know? Sundar continued. What she said when she learned you were alive. She asked if you would forgive her. Rayu's breath hitched just slightly at that. His fists loosened. His eyes softened, though only for a second. But before he could answer, the sound of hurried footsteps interrupted them. Sundar turned just in time to see one of his assistants running up the lane, toward them, waving a phone in his hand. Sir, the assistant called breathlessly. We have a problem. You need to see this. Now Sundar took the phone, his brow furrowing. He glanced at the screen, and his eyes darkened. He muttered, almost to himself, no, this doesn't make sense. Kamala and Raju both watched him, confused. What is it? Kamala asked softly. Sundar looked up at her, his expression grim now. Amma, he said, there's more to this. The money stolen from your account, it wasn't just greed, it was part of something bigger, much bigger. Raju frowned. What do you mean? Sundar turned the screen so they could see it. It showed a series of transactions not just from Kamala's account but dozens of others, all funneling into the same shadow account overseas. This wasn't just your manager, Sundar said, his voice low and serious. This is organized. Someone's using accounts like yours to launder money on a much larger scale. And the trail, it doesn't end here. Kamala stared at the screen, bewildered, but Rayu's face hardened as he looked at the numbers. Who's behind it? Raju asked, his voice quiet but intense. Sundar slid the phone back into his pocket. His eyes narrowed, and for the first time all evening his calm cracked, revealing something sharper underneath. Someone who knew everything about her. He said, her habits, her balance, her vulnerability, and someone who's still watching. Come on. Hands flew to her mouth. Watching, she whispered. Just then, the faint sound of a car engine idling came from the end of the lane. Sundar turned his head sharply and saw a black car parked just out of sight, its tinted windows glinting in the fading light. He stepped forward, his voice low but firm. Stay here, he told Kamala and Raju, but as he began walking toward the car, its engine revved and it sped away, tires screeching, disappearing into the growing darkness. Sundar stood at the end of the lane, watching the spot where it vanished, his hands clenched at his sides. He whispered to himself, so, it's you two. Then he turned back to Kamala and Raju, his face set with quiet determination. This isn't over, he said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. Behind him, the shadows of the lane grew longer, and somewhere beyond them, the real enemy waited. The final stand. Night had fully descended over the city, wrapping its streets and alleys in a quiet darkness that felt heavier than usual. Streetlights flickered, casting long shadows across the narrow lane where Sundar stood, staring at the place where the black car had disappeared. Behind him, Kamala and Raju remained silent, each lost in their own storm of thoughts. The air felt charged now, not with anger or sadness, but with something deeper, something dangerous. Sundar's mind was racing, not just with what he had seen, but with what it meant. The stolen money wasn't simply the act of a greedy manager or a scared clerk. It had a pattern, a method, dozens of accounts, all emptied in small amounts, all redirected quietly into the same shadowy space. Whoever was behind this wasn't working alone. This was bigger than one branch, bigger than one bank. He turned to Kamala and Raju, his expression softer now. Raju, I need you to go home. Lock the doors. Stay with your grandson. I'll take care of the rest. Sundar said. Kamala reached out, taking Sundar's hand. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was firm. You saved me, she whispered. You saved us. Whatever happens now, I will never forget. Sundar gave her a faint smile. Then he turned to Raju and handed him a slip of paper. This is my direct number, Sundar said. If anything happens, call me. No one else. Raju nodded silently. They turned and began walking back down the lane, slowly, hand in hand. Sundar watched them until they disappeared into the night. Back inside the car, Sundar was already on the phone. Connect me to the Internal Audit Division, he said into the receiver. I need every report from the last 6 months on low volume, high-frequency withdrawals across all branches in this region. Send it to me within the hour. And one more thing. Flag any employees who accessed more than 3 dormant accounts in a 60-day period. His voice was steady, but inside, the fire was building. This wasn't just about fixing a system. This was about protecting the very heart of what trust meant. Because if people like Kamala couldn't trust a bank with their savings, if the system treated the vulnerable as prey instead of as people, then everything Sundar had worked for, every speech, every innovation, every policy meant nothing. His phone buzzed again. A new message had arrived. A name. Ashok Singh, the head of regional operations. Sundar's eyes narrowed. He knew the name. He'd met Ashok once, years ago, a man with polished shoes and smooth words, always smiling but never listening. Sundar remembered shaking his hand and feeling nothing behind the grip. It was like grasping a shadow. The message continued. Singh coordinated a shell company overseas. He created fake audit trails. Every branch he oversaw had at least one employee quietly pressured into helping him. He's disappearing assets, and he knows you're onto him. Sundar didn't hesitate. Find him, he said. Track his location. Now, at dawn, Sundar stood outside a high-rise building on the city's edge. The sky was still a deep gray, and the street was mostly empty. Above him, lights were still on in one of the upper floors, the kind of glow that never belonged to a home. Too sterile, too clinical, a place for business, or for secrets. He entered the building, his footsteps echoing in the marble lobby. The elevator ride was silent. The kind of silence that doesn't comfort, it waits. When he reached the top floor, the doors opened to a suite of glass offices, and there, standing at a desk with his back turned, was Ashok Singh. Hello, Sundar, Ashok said, without turning. I knew you'd come. Sundar stepped inside slowly. You've been busy, Sundar said, stealing from the voiceless, laundering it through fake channels, covering your tracks with people too scared to speak. Ashok turned, a calm smile on his face. He wore an expensive suit, gold cufflinks, and eyes that held no regret. You can't prove it, he said simply. Even if you could, I've already moved it all. They'll never trace it back to me and you. What are you going to do? Ruin me with a press conference? Sundar didn't flinch. Instead, he pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. I don't need a press conference, he said. I just needed you to say that out loud. From his pocket, he pulled a tiny audio device. It had been recording the entire exchange. Ashok's smile faded. Asterisk, this building is owned by our foundation. Sundar continued. The room is wired. Your voice, your words, they've been transmitted to our legal team in real time. And in about 2 minutes, officers will walk through that door and take you into custody. Ashok lunged toward Sundar, but the door burst open before he could take another step. Uniformed officers flooded in, pinning him to the floor as he screamed in frustration. You don't get to hide anymore, Sundar said quietly. Not behind your money, not behind your power. Ashok shouted, they'll never believe you over me. I built this place. Sundar looked down at him, calm as stone. No, he said, you built a house on broken trust, and now it's falling. By noon, the news had spread. Media vans parked outside the bank's headquarters. Anchors spoke in shocked tones about the scandal, the fraud, the laundering, the betrayal, but they also spoke of the old woman in the blue sari. of her strength, of her quiet dignity. They spoke of Sundar Pichai, not the tech leader, not the public figure, but the man who walked into a small branch, picked up a fallen envelope, and stood up for someone no one else had seen. Asterisk.